and good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for a closer look at the Assessments module. Please note this webinar is being recorded, and especially for our friends over in DC who cannot join us due to the power outages. The Assessments module is a tool that can help manage your backlog and record the condition of your collection materials. Today, we will look at how assessment plays a role within the wider picture of collection management, how the assessment module was developed. We'll run through the functionalities of this feature in ArchivesSpace and how it might be implemented within collection management workflows. Presenting today, we have Dan Santamaria, the Director of Digital Collections and Archives over at Tufts University. Dan oversees all of the digital collections and archive staff, collections, and services with primary responsibility for strategic direction, planning, management, and collection development. We also have Adrienne Pruitt, the Collections Management Archivist at Tufts University. Adrian oversees collection management and archival processing. This includes managing preservation, assessing collections, and planning and prioritizing processing work. And finally, we have Christie Peterson, the Head of Technical Services at Smith College. Christie helps make sure the unique materials in the Mortimer Rare Book Collection, the College Archives, and the Sophia Smith Collection are discoverable, usable, and well cared for. Thank you for joining us today. Dan will start us off by sharing his role in getting the Assessments Module project moving. We'll hold for questions at the end.
Hi, everybody. Good to talk to you today. If you hear wind howling, if you hear howling, I should say, it's not me, it's the wind. It's kind of onerous to see trees shaking in the out the window here. But I'm going to talk to you about collection assessment, just give you a whirlwind overview of what it is, why we think it's important, and why we wanted to fund the assessment module before Christie and Adrian show you the exciting details of both the module and the work that they're doing. So collection assessment is the systematic, purposeful gathering of information about archival collections. If you worked in archives and special collections for a while, I'm sure you've experienced knowledge about archival holdings being impressionistic and anecdotal. Sometimes it lives in people's heads, sometimes it lives on paper, sometimes it's not anywhere. And assessment work is really a way to gather that knowledge and make use of it. And you would do that for all of these reasons: to expose hidden collections, to establish priorities in processing and digitization, preservation, even conservation work, and overall to create more access and help you with collection management efforts. The most common way to undertake an assessment project is to conduct a survey. So these can be done to varying levels of detail, obviously, but generally, again, used to gather information about the content and conditions of collections. Can be used to, in addition to prioritization, to apply for funding, whether you're an individual repository or especially a consortium. And one goal that I'd add that I don't think is discussed quite as often is helping staff see the bigger picture of stewarding all of your collections and providing access to the entirety of your holdings. So rather than working on collections one by one, they'll take shorter passes at more collections and hopefully multiple passes at multiple collections. And that really tends to emphasize the need to manage all the collections in your custody. And also say the various ratings that are assigned to collections and the prioritization are really a form of appraisal. And end up being a really good way to look at collection development policies or run deaccessioning projects. It just generally helps staff exercise appraisal muscles. So Adrian and Christie are going to talk in more detail about specific projects, but overall the steps when you're conducting a survey: you're going to plan and determine the scope, method, and data collection system. You're going to survey collections, and you're going to analyze your data and plan and prioritize future projects. I think Using descriptive data to make baseline level records available online is something to call out here. It's great and essential really to prioritize your work, but you can really use the basic data that you're gathering to get baseline descriptions of all your holdings out to users, which is something that we should all be doing, and something that you may have heard is codified in the new DAX principles. Good candidates for surveying is everything we list here. Unprocessed collections, accruals, things that are partially processed or done in a way to a standard that existed decades or years ago. Collections that are only partially described. But really, again, the most effective way is to deal with all the holdings in your repository. The way to make this work is to take the approach that you're covering everything. The goal is to really help you decide where to spend your time and where your time is most valuable, and thinking across all of your collections is the best way to do that. So why did we fund the ArchivesSpace Assessment Module? Our story starts here. It kind of goes back a ways too. Assessment's been around for quite a while now, but the tools that have been used have been somewhat limited or somewhat siloed, or in a lot of cases both. This is just a screenshot of a few tools. Local databases, there's the Paxskill Consortial Survey Initiative database, which is one of the larger database that was used in one of the larger consortial projects, assessment projects. And these all serve their purposes, but generally speaking, they're separate from the systems that manage descriptive and other collections management data. The Archivist Toolkit assessment module started to change that, but the first iterations of ArchivesSpace didn't include an assessment module. And we knew we needed to do a large assessment project, and we had recently migrated to ArchivesSpace. So one of the reasons this works for us is that ArchivesSpace is based on archival descriptive standards. This might not sound groundbreaking to an audience of archivists, but when your previous systems didn't map to DAX, you'll appreciate how much easier ArchivesSpace makes achieving DAX compliance, which is one of our goals. We also had other community efforts to build on. The HSP Paxskill survey methodology, which dates back to the 2000s, is really a de facto standard for creating assessment ratings. And the Archivist Toolkit assessment module is based on that. And we were really able to use that as a model for much of the ArchivesSpace module. We realized that sticking to AT and those Paxskill ratings would provide a clear migration path forward, not just for us, but for people who had assessment data in other tools, whether that was AT or another tool. And finally, there's a significant amount of work creating a spec for ArchivesSpace collection module a few years ago before we started. And that was a great starting point for us. It allowed us to scope the project in a way that matched our resources and the time we had allotted for the project. So ultimately, the reason why we decided to develop the assessment module in ArchivesSpace specifically was the ability to use our resources to produce something that would benefit the entire archival community. The ability to help make ArchivesSpace better for everyone is really appealing to us, especially because collection assessment and surveying is a really key part of our collections management work, and we think probably has broad applicability to everyone's collections management work. Helping us make sure we have the DAX compliant description of everything that we have, and really it allows us to take an iterative approach to processing and description. And overall, ArchivesSpace makes the assessment work that we do, and really all of our work, much easier, and we think it will for you as well. So with that, we'll send it over to Adrienne so she can talk a little bit more about the development process and demo the module for you.
Thanks, Dan. So since I get the fun bit here, and my PowerPoint is enormous, can you all see the slide? Can someone use their voice to tell me if they can see it or not?
We can see your slide. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I'm Adrienne Pruitt. I'm the Collections Management Archivist at Tufts, and I manage the development of the assessment module here. And we've been using it for a collection-wide survey here at Tufts as well. I will just warn you that I am recovering from a bit of a cold, and I'm also the one that has to talk the longest. So oh no, tragedy, come back. So if you hear me stopping at any point to get a sip of water, I'm just going to warn you that's probably going to happen. So as Dan mentioned, we adapted existing community specifications to create the assessment module in ASpace. There had been a final spec for user requirements put out around 2015, as well as a field spreadsheet that we adapted. We selected Hudson Malanglo to work with based on their quote, and also based on the fact that we'd worked with them previously to do the migration from our homegrown CMS to ASpace, so we knew that they were good to work with. We identified a scope of work for the contract with those developers. So because we had a certain amount of time and a certain amount of money, we had to select what the most important things to develop were. So not everything that was in the original spec got developed. One of the things that didn't was the recommendation for dashboard functionality, so that may be an area for future development. Because that sort of impinged on the overall functionality of ASpace, we did not work on that part of the original spec, but everything else pretty much made it in, and we added a few fields as well. So HM created a test environment for us, and then we started testing. We kept track of issues in Pivotal Tracker. We had weekly or biweekly meetings for basically a summer, May through September of 2017. And then when it was in pretty good shape, there was testing by outside volunteers. We'll just give a shout out to Barb Akins and Nancy Kennedy, Sarah Lou, Christie Peterson, hi Christie, Meg Hickson and Caitlin Wells. They all helped to do the testing, which was great. It really had the tires kicked. And then at that point, when it was pretty much done, I created the mouse over text and the documentation so that it would be usable. Assessment records contain quantitative and qualitative information on the materials, lists the existing documentation, provides ratings for a variety of different things. There are also checkboxes for formats and conservation issues, and there's information, administrative information about the assessment itself. Assessment records can be linked to an accession, to a resource, to a component, like an archival component, and to digital object records. So one assessment record can be linked to many different things, or to one thing, depending on what your workflow is. And an assessment can be created at any point in a record's life cycle, and for a variety of reasons. So say you're doing a collection-wide survey, that could be a reason. Say you're doing a survey to find artifacts that would be good for an upcoming exhibit, or you're only looking at your digital object records. You could do assessments for a wide variety of reasons. The only required elements in an assessment record are a link to the object record, so it has to be an assessment of something, a link to the person who did the assessment, and the date that the survey began. So that would give you a very minimal record. It wouldn't be that useful, but at that point you could click Save. So we're going to start with the super basic thing, which is just looking at what assessment records you have. You can browse them. You can also view them from within a linked record. So I'm going to demo that. Let me know if this part doesn't go well, but we're going to try it. Okay, so from ASpace, you would just click Browse and Assessments, and then it would give you the list, which is automatically sorted by ID number. You'll also see there's a variety of facets along the side here that you could further filter down through. You could also decide to change the order of the materials. So you could, we're just going to fast forward a little bit here. This is not where we need to be. All right, let's stop this and go back. Sorry about this. This is the first time we've done it this way, so let's start over. So viewing, you would go to Browse, you would choose Assessments. Your list would come up. You can sort it in a variety of ways. So you have the ID, the facets along the side there. You could choose to sort it differently by ID number or by survey completed date. You can also choose to facet further on various items like ID, and then you have a list that you can choose from. You can also search from inside a record. So when you do a keyword search, you'll see assessment pops up. But if you click on the record itself, as we're doing here, you can also view the assessment records from inside. You'll see the left-hand side. You click Assessment, you click View, and there it is. And so that's sort of what a completed assessment record looks like. We're also going to go over how to create them, of course, so that's just an example. So let's look, now that we know how to search for them, we'll sort of backtrack a little bit and go over how to create them. Like searching, you can create an assessment from the main menu, or you can create it from inside the record. So from the main menu, you would just click Create and choose Assessment. Again, the minimal things that you need to put in are what you're surveying. And you do have to add that because you're creating it from scratch from the main menu. This is the dev server, so it'll take just a second to pull up. There we go. Those are the records. You're putting in who's doing the surveying. Do note that that is limited to people who have records in ASpace, and that's all you need to save it. You can also go to within a record. So here we are, and say we want to create an assessment. We'd click More, Create Assessment. And you don't have to add the record because you're creating it from within the record. It knows what you want to survey. You do just have to add who is doing the assessment and click Save. And that's how you would create a minimal assessment record, either from the main menu or from within a record. So once you've done that, you want to add a little bit more information because that's not really enough. And the separate areas inside the assessment record are existing documentation, administrative information, who did the survey, etc., the assessment information on ratings, the list of material types and formats, and the conservation issues. So here we are within a record. We're going to demo how to create one from within a record. Whoops, go back. Play. Okay, so More, Create Assessment, and it will pop up. We'll put in who needs to do the assessment. There I am. Great. We'll save it. And then through movie magic, we will magically skip to one that is already filled out, so you don't have to wait for me to do all of that. Here's your existing description. You can also add a note to clarify more about that. I'm the person who did it. It only took me a day, took me half an hour. Extent surveyed is in cubic feet. Each of these fields does have a mouse over if you need a field definition or help to know what to put in there. You can also select someone to do the review. In this case, we're picking Dan because he's my boss, and they can add a note to tell you what the review is. The purpose is a survey. The scope is entirety. You can choose if there's any sensitive material. Inactive means that this won't be included in reports. We'll talk about that more a little bit later. All of the ratings fields have notes that you can add, and they also have a little question mark that you can click on to give you what the pre-formatted ratings are. You can change those in the YAML file if you want. List of materials and special notes, exhibition value, monetary value if you track that. We don't, but some people do. And again, little mouse over definitions, conservation issues. You can add additional conservation issues, as you see here. We'll talk about that separately. But if you have things that are very important to your repository. You can add conservation issues, and then you can save it. And that is it for creating a assessment record. I know I went over that very quickly, but because there's a lot of material to cover here, I'm trying to stick to my 20 minutes. And if there's questions at the end, we can go over those as well, of course. All right. So I mentioned that you can add other material formats, conservation issues, and ratings to your assessment records. You do that by managing the assessment attributes. So out-of-the-box systems administrators are the only people who have permission to manage the assessment attributes, but they can also grant permissions to others just using the manage groups function, so we'll go over that. And this is just a little wiggly bit, but something that's useful to remember is if you do work in multiple repositories and you using this function, you create attributes in a repository, that same attribute has to be present in every other repository if you're going to try and transfer records between them. So I'll show you an example of that, but it's just a little thing to remember. We'll also go over deleting attributes if in case you added something that, wait, you didn't really mean to, and how to see linked records on certain attributes if you need to know what to change in order to delete one. So the first thing you want to do as a systems admin is make sure that you go in to manage groups and choose your groups here. Let's say project managers need to be able to create, update, delete, and assessment records, and also the assessment attributes. So you'll do that when you first start using this module. Make sure that everyone who has the appropriate permissions, that they'll need to do their work. Then under the Settings tab, that's the little gear, you'll click Manage Assessment Attributes if you want to change anything here. So you can add an additional 10 repository ratings, an additional 20 material types and formats, and additional conservation issues. That seems like a lot, but it's not really. So you're probably going to want to plan those out better than I have in the examples here. So the little red X is for deletion, the little green plus is to add something. Let's say for whatever reason, we're surveying a whole bunch of curtains, and brocade would really be more of a material type, not a conservation issue, so let's add some more information there. Our brocade is dusty. Okay, good. And then we'll save that. Now, if I had a record that had an assessment with that information in it, and I wanted to transfer that resource record to another repository, and make sure that all of its assessment information transferred, I want to make sure that that same attribute was present in my other repository. So let's go take a look at my other repository and see what the assessment attributes are there. Come on, there we go. So here we'll see that I do not, in fact, have a conservation issue for brocade is dusty. I only have rolled materials. So if I was going to transfer stuff back and forth, I would need to make sure that that was changed. And if you're in a multi repository situation, that could be an issue, especially since you're limited to the number of attributes that you can add. All right, so here, let's take a look at what we would want to do to delete an attribute. So let's say we think brocade is dusty is silly. We'll just click the little red X and click Save, and then you get a happy little green message that says, yes, you are successful. So that's good. Let's look at what happens if you are not successful. So let's try and delete slumped and save assessment attributes. Uh-oh, we have a red message that says, no, you cannot. That attribute is in use by an assessment. And you say, really? Which one? You click on the little magnifying glass, and that will tell you which records are currently using that attribute, and you can decide if you want to go into that record and remove that attribute and then go back and delete the attribute because it's no longer in use. I can see that this would be onerous if you had quite a few records that were using an attribute that you decided you didn't want anymore. So you could probably decide to address that through the back end rather than the front end here. You'll also see that as a sysadmin, you have this option to jump right back to the additional conservation issues. People without that permission won't see that message. It just says contact your sysadmin to do this. So that's how you would manage the assessment attributes. And you can also delete and transfer assessment records back and forth. This is also sort of complicated. Deleting's very simple, so we'll demo that first because that's really easy. But transferring them is complicated. One thing to remember is if an assessment record has only one linked record, so it's an assessment of a resource and that's it, and that resource gets transferred to another repository, then that's fine. The assessment record is just like a suitcase that the resource record takes along with it. It just moves to the new repository. With the caveat that all of the fields need to exist in the same repository that I mentioned earlier. If you have an assessment record that's not that neat and tidy but has multiple linked records, and not all of the linked records are transferred, then the assessment record is duplicated in the new repository, and it also still exists in the old one. So you might want to be kind of careful about how you do this, because transferring some but not all of an assessment's linked records could lead to inaccurate assessments. So say that you did an assessment of some photographs and also some musical instruments, and under special formats you wrote contains oboes, and then you transfer the photographs to another repository. It's still going to say contains oboes, but that's not going to be correct any longer. So first, the easy thing, how to delete. You can delete from the search browse list, results list, as you see here. So let's go over what that would look like. You would just click on the little checkbox for the thing that you wanted to delete, and then you would click delete, and you would get, again, a little happy green message saying that you were successful, but we're going to save that for later. Let's go into the assessment record itself. You can also delete from within the assessment record, and here we're going to say delete that from within the assessment record, and it'll say, are you sure? And you'll say yes, and it'll say the assessment's deleted. So that's the quick and easy deletion. Transferring, like I said, is more complicated, so we'll go over how that would work. So here we have a collection, and it's got 2 assessments. One of the assessments is linked to 2 items, this one and another one. So if we transfer this collection to our test repository, the assessment that's just for this record will transfer beautifully all by itself and won't leave anything behind. The second assessment will duplicate in the new repository, and it will still exist in the old repository as well. So let's go ahead and go to the new repository and take a look at what that looks like. Okay, and so here is my original record, and here is the duplicate record that was carried over from the other collection. If we go back and look in the original repository, we will see the record for the assessment that surveyed 2 things is still in the original repository. It just looks a little bit different now, so let's take a look at that. Okay, so we'll do it by ID because it'll be our most recently created one. There we go. And here you'll see the first time you do this, because it takes a minute to re-index, both collections will still be listed, but then after you click on it and it has time to re-index, you'll see, in fact, it is only on 1 object now. So this was the assessment that originally looked at 2 records. Now it only lists 1. And so you can see where you could easily create inaccurate assessment records by transferring one but not the other. All right, that's probably a pretty rare case, but it's wicked complicated, so I just wanted to make sure I went through it. Assessment reports, this is probably of much more interest to people. This was another area that we sort of did what we thought was the absolute necessity, and it could probably be expanded by further development if people were interested in doing that. So note that reports do not include inactive records, as I mentioned earlier. So if you click something inactive because it's been superseded by a more recent assessment, it's not going to show up in these reports. There are two types of reports: the assessment rating report, which allows you to choose a date range, a rating type, a rating range, and the assessment record list, which just allows you to choose a date range. Note that in the assessment rating report, only global repository values are included, so it's not going to include any of those added assessment attributes that you've added in yourself. And both reports are available in those 4 formats. So let's look at what that looks like. If you're used to creating reports in ASpace, this will be super familiar to you. Come on, just play. So you'll go under Create and Background Job, Reports. You'll choose the report you want, and so there we go. There's assessment rating, an assessment record list. We're just going to look at assessment rating in the interest of time because it's the more complicated one. So here are your ratings. So let's say that I want everything with a combined research value of, say, 5 and higher. So we'll select research value or select 5 and higher. And what kind of format do we want? Let's say HTML so we can see it on our screen right now rather than having to open a separate file and download it. You queue the job as you would normally. You wait for it to update. And then it'll be prompted to refresh the screen when it's complete. There we go. And you can download the report, and that'll just view right there. So you may want to download your reports in CSV. That's probably most useful for reporting purposes, but it really depends on what your workflow is. And the second report, which is the accession records report, just gives you a list with all of the fields for all of your accession records within a certain time frame that you can delimit. So that one is potentially more useful for your internal analysis process, but it's less fun to look at on the screen, so we're going to skip that one for now. You can also import assessment records via CSV. So if, for example, you started your survey a year ago when you just had a spreadsheet and you want to get that information into ASpace, you can do so. The template is on GitHub, and the only required fields are the ones that you would require for an accession record in general, or an assessment record in general, which would be the link, who did it, and the date, and of course after that it's up to you. You can enter yes, no for the checkbox fields and the free text fields. There is a README that guides you through all of the fields. You can also add any custom assessment attributes. You just have to make sure that the relevant header and field title are in the spreadsheet and that you have already put those assessment attributes in ASpace. So I'll just do a very quick demo of that. So I've downloaded the template. I'm going to fill it out. I'm going to put in the resource that's the link. How do I find that? It has to be an ASpace ID number, and that's just at the very top of your browser there. So you see resource 758 with the underscore. You fill out all of the fields according to the guidelines for filling out all of those fields. And then when this CSV is ready, you do an import just like you would do for any other import of information into ASpace. We'll go ahead and close this because we're done with it. Okay. And then you would just go in and do the background job, import data, assessment CSV, add the file that you need, possibly have a less complicated directory structure than I do. Give the job, you wait for it to go through. I demoed a successful one because that is better. But you will sometimes get error messages that'll tell you. It usually has to do with a very small formatting thing in a field title or in the data. So it's usually pretty easy to clean up, and there we go. It imported like we want it to, and there's our assessment. So that is very useful if you've been using other systems to keep your assessment information and you want it all in ASpace, because there is a great advantage to having it all in one place. Okay, I've been talking for a super long time, so I'm going to go really quickly through what our project currently is, which is a survey of all of our holdings, which has been going on since spring of 2016 and is due to wrap up later this month. 693 collections and about 8,000 cubic feet, both analog and physical materials, and that time does include breaks in the summer and fall for processing work and work on other things. The first phase of the manuscripts did use a Google Sheet, which is why it was super important for us to be able to import information into ASpace. And the second phase has mostly used the assessment module because that's one of the reasons we funded it. So it's been really great to have. Our goals for this project have been updated, accurate, publicly available collection-level information for all of our collections, collection-level DAX compliance and description for the very first time ever, so that's exciting, and assessment data that's going to help us refine our collection development policy, prioritize our processing, digitization, and preservation. The survey team includes me, the digital archivist, 3 graduate students, and there has been some participation by other staff members as well, including our digital collections project manager and our records and accessioning archivist. So there's some of our listings of assessments in our database, and here's just a super simple example of ways that you might want to assess your data. So here are all of the things that have the highest research value and the lowest intellectual access, which might suggest that they are due for some better description.
I'm Christie Peterson. I am the head of technical services for special collections, not for the whole library, just for special collections at Smith College. And it's quiet outside right now, but I realized as I was prepping for this, I just popped a link into the chat to a webcam for some construction that's happening about 50 yards away from me right now. So if you hear background noise, I apologize, and that's what's going on. So I wanted to talk to you about the special collections, just so you can understand the ways that we're planning to use the assessment module and maybe get some ideas for how you might want to be using it also. A little bit of background about the Smith College Special Collections. As I'm sure many of you are in similar situations, we have 3 repositories within the special collections. The College Archives, what you would expect from the College Archives. It has, at this point, very little standardized data. The most useful descriptive data we have about it is a printed 3-ring binder in the reading. The second is the Mortimer Rare Books collection, which the collecting has been going on for over a century at this point, but the first room, as in Mortimer Rare Books room, was in 1937. And the descriptive practices, both for the rare books, but they do have literary manuscript collections in there. For example, Sylvia Plath papers, Virginia Woolf papers, Anne M. Martin papers, if anyone is like me, a fan. But it's all been done along a very strongly bibliographic tradition as opposed to an archives tradition. And most of the finding aids at this point are only in paper with just a couple of them online. And finally, we have the Sophia Smith collection, which is a women's history collection. Smith College is a women's college, so it makes sense that this is here. It's got personal papers, organizational records, and also some artificial subject collections. And it has a lot of descriptive tools available about it, including some legacy databases that were internal staff only, things in word process documents, and some online EAD finding aids. I am the first person who has ever been tasked with attempting to bring all three of these into one collection management ecosystem in terms of processing practices, descriptive practices, accessioning practices, all of these things. So that's what we're working on at this point. We're also coming at this, there's lots of threes in my presentation, with three distinct streams of assessment data that I see us using in the near future. One of them is, particularly in the Sophia Smith collection, we have these are blocks of text that had been created in that local internal collections database that I mentioned. When we migrated into ArchivesSpace, they got migrated into the collections management subrecord. And here's a picture of what that looks like. You can see it's a big block of text. It's got some good stuff in there. Some of the things that it doesn't have in here that I think really point out the strengths of the assessment module and why you the assessments module. There's no information whatsoever about who wrote this, when it was written, what has been done since this was written. And it's also really interesting. This was clearly written in a time when refoldering, removing metal fasteners, rubber bands, etc. was really important, which is not something that we do these days. Another stream of assessment data is the MOVE survey. I shared with y'all that webcam of what's going on. That building that's getting destroyed is where we used to be. So we moved out of our spaces last summer, and for the 2 years prior to that, there was a box container level survey going on to enable that move to happen. It was done in a spreadsheet, and people who were doing it started noticing preservation issues and flagging things like boxes bursting is one of our columns. There's also columns about like this smells like mold, things like that. And so they were flagged in individual columns. So it's theoretically something that we could import using, if we put it into a with the ArchivesSpace Assessment Module import. However, and this is an important distinction to note, the data that was being collected was about the container. People were looking at the stuff on the shelf and doing a row in the spreadsheet about what they saw on the container in the spreadsheet. But the assessments modules, the assessments don't link to containers. They link to archival objects and to digital objects, which makes a lot of sense, and I agree with. Just be aware that you also, if you have legacy survey data, might run into that particular conflict, and that's something that you have to work around. And then new assessments. I think the majority of our data in here is going to come from new and ongoing assessments. We have this Access to Collections project, which is, in previous years, it would have been called a backlog project. It's going to be a 3-year project. I'm going to be posting 6 jobs, 5 that are term project positions and 1 that's a permanent one in the next few months. And we are going to bring those 3 streams of data all up to a minimum online level of access. We're also implementing an accessioning as processing workflow, which I think there's a really good opportunity for us to get some assessment data right up front at the time that we're doing the accessioning. And then ongoing iterative processing, so we can keep track of where where work is getting done in the collections. I already showed you that. I just want to make a point here, and this is something that Dan touched on, but I'm going to be really heavy-handed with it, that assessing and prioritizing your collections, just doing that will not eliminate your backlog. You have to take the next step to decide to use that data. We have a long history here of assessing our collections and prioritizing them. I was just yesterday looking at a prioritization list from 2005. And what happened was the things at the top of the list got processed and the stuff at the bottom of the list never did get processed. So just be aware that it's not a panacea. Also, creating and migrating assessment data is work, and project like I am, I'm keenly aware of wanting to put staff to work on things that are going to get us the most bang for the buck. So all of the assessment data that we create needs to serve a very explicit purpose. The purposes that I think we're going to be using the assessments for to track and report on our progress in this Access to Collections project. I used to use one of the tools that Dan showed you earlier at Mud Manuscript Library when I worked for Dan. And we used to talk about bringing all of our collections up to level 3. And that's a good way to think about it. Like, how many of your collections are at a level 2 or a level 3 or a level 4 for the different elements that you can assess in there. We're also going to be identifying the specific collection needs in an actionable way. So all those things that when you're doing really focused work and you see something else that should get addressed, but your boss is going to tell you not to do it right now. So for example, maybe this collection could really use some refoldering, but you're not doing that right now. This is a way to record and then at a later date find, for example, all the collections that need some reboxing. Here's 50 collections that need reboxing. We have a student for the summer. We're going to have the student do the reboxing. And another thing that we're going to be doing this is to hopefully identify more systemic needs, the things that aren't just one collection here, one collection there, but hey, we've got actually a ton of stuff that all has this one need. And so we can think bigger picture about how to address it. The principles coming from that about how we're going to be doing the assessment data. As we want systemic data. We don't want data here and data there. We're going to be integrating the assessment activities with our other activities that we're already doing, and assessments are iterative. I'm not sure how clear it was from the demo, but you can do as many assessments as you want to on a single collection or a single object. And you can, and with the subsequent dates, just add to the information or change the information. So what we're actually going to be doing, one of the first things we're going to do is we're going to be localizing some of the wording and some of the options so that they make sense and are very clear to us locally what they mean. I confirmed with people who actually taught the class on plugins recently at the Code for Lib conference that this is a great candidate for a plugin. I'm gonna just rename a few fields and take a few of them, make a few of them not appear on the sheet, not actually affecting the underlying data model at all, just what the users see. We're also gonna just hide some stuff that we don't want used at all right now. So this entire sub-record of it about material types and formats is just not something that I want anyone to enter data into right now. Instead, I'm having staff assign genre form terms to actual archival objects instead of listing them here, so that that information is available to our users as well as to us. And finally is documentation and training, which is something that we are building up a lot. Right now we've got a down and dirty wiki going in GitHub, and I anticipate this will be our tool for at least the next couple of years, but it's where we document how we do what we do, and that's going to include how we do assessments and what goes in all of the fields. So that's all I have for this moment. Christine, do you want to take over again?
Thank you, Dan and Adrian and Christie, for all sharing on your experiences. So we'll now open up the floor for questions or comments on anything to do with the assessments module. And if anyone has any stories or insights into their own assessment experiences, please feel free to jump in. It looks like we already have a question coming in. How do reviewers get notified that they need to review an assessment record?
Hi, this is Adrienne. So when you do a search on your assessment records, review needed is one of the facets that pops up along the left-hand side. So you can see both how many of your assessments need a review and who needs to do the reviewing. That's currently how I know that something needs my review because I do review all of the student assessments. That was something that was going to be part of the initially proposed dashboard, but right now you have to go and look. It's not like you get an email message or anything. So, yeah.
Hi, this is Christie, and I'm going to respond to a question that I see that Vivian Lee Solik popped into the chat about thoughts about when or how you might use the assessment module in a collection that is being reprocessed. This is absolutely what we are doing. And so my plan is that every time we touch a collection in the sense that we augment the description to it, we do something with it that improves the arrangement or description of it, that we do a new assessment record for it so that we can keep track of what the current state of it is. And like I said earlier, then you can do reports, for example, on what are all of your collections that already have a really high level of housing but have a really low level of description available. And you can target those for a certain type of work, namely descriptive work, and try to just bring everything up to a baseline level. So does that make sense? That's how I plan to do it anyhow. If anybody else wants to jump in, you're welcome.
Hi, this is Adrienne. I was going to respond to a question from Lisa about can I explain again why assessment attributes would need to be transferred between repositories. And sure, Lisa. So you actually phrased it correctly the first time. Assessment attributes would need to be shared between repositories in order for records to transfer completely. And so you can't just transfer an assessment record. But if you were going to transfer, say, a resource record that had an assessment record with it from one repository to another, the same fields would need to be present in both repositories in order for that assessment record to transfer completely.
Hi, and this is Dan again. Just to answer the Harvard University Archives question, which is how did you get your AT assessment data into ASpace? We did not do that because we were actually coming from a locally developed tool. It sounds like Christie, that is also the case where data is coming from a bunch of different places. So originally what you would do is have to get out your assessment data from AT in some sort of CSV format. And we, as I said before, we took pains to make sure there was a clear migration path. That's one of the reasons why we wanted to stick to the Pascal ratings and the AT fields and all those checkboxes to match to make sure that that is a reasonable way forward. But there's also work on the actual AT migration tool that would allow you to get your data from AT, all of your data from AT into ArchivesSpace, including the assessment data, as I understand it.
And this is Adrienne. There's a question about plans for local ratings to be reportable in an update. And so just to be clear, local ratings don't appear in that assessment ratings report. However, local ratings, the assessment attributes that you've added, do export in the larger report that lists all of your assessment records, including every field in them. So it's a little bit more work to sort of beat the information you want out of that enormous CSV, but they do export.
Adding attributes like the little checkboxes for that Adrian was showing. My understanding, the way I had planned to do it, was to go in, manually create the checkboxes, although I'm sure you could probably do it through the API, and then have that all set up before we import the spreadsheet that has the CSV that has the actual assessment data in it, if that makes sense.
This is Adrian, that's correct. You would want to create them in ASpace before you tried to do an import, because otherwise it would fail.
We might have time for possibly one last question if anyone has any burning thoughts. All right, I think it's safe to wrap up then. Thank you all for joining us today for this webinar. The recording of this webinar will be available soon. If you have any other questions, please feel free to contact any of us. Thank you so much and have a great afternoon.
Okay, thank you.